Just because you walk around in your birthday suit in the middle of the night half-conscious doesn't mean you're a skinwalker. But I definitely have a story or two today about some walkers of the skin. Today's episode features monsters in the woods, monsters that cause PTSD in forest rangers, and a prison that is probably, extremely, most likely haunted. Enjoy these allegedly true scary stories, and remember, when the apocalypse happens, please don't come to my house. If you have a story of your own, be sure to send it to us at darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. Now, let's begin. I have a friend named John, from RJB. On May 19th in 2015, John came home a different man. It was the night that haunts his dreams. I knew him once as a bright, happy, and kind man, but after that night, he was different. John was a forest ranger in Arkansas for 8 years. He was 6'5", never got scared very easily. He was a tough and rather built guy, and on that night, I had pulled into his driveway at around 10:30 p.m. to pay him a surprise visit. I lived in Louisiana at the time. He hadn't made it home from work yet, so I figured he might have had to work later than usual, as he'd said that it happens sometimes. He didn't know I was coming, and I hadn't seen him in 2 years. John pulled up about half an hour after me. He parked beside me and shut off the engine. However, he did not get out. I got out of my little Ford Ranger and walked to the passenger side to open his door. I opened it to see a grown man crying. The smell of alcohol was thick in the air. Obviously, he had been drinking. "John, what's wrong?" I asked him nervously. He continued to cry, so I placed my hand on his shoulder, but he immediately jerked away. "John, it's me, Ryan." I thought he may not have recognized me, because I had grown a full beard in the 2 years we hadn't hung out. "Come on, man, let's go inside," I told him. He clumsily stumbled out of his truck. I wrapped my arm around him, helping him walk. Then I carried him over to his sofa and sat next to him. "John, what the hell happened to you?" He didn't respond at first, but he did stop crying at a point. He was pale and had a look on his face like he had been to war. Shell shock, I think it's called. I repeated myself. He looked at me with tears drying in his cheeks. "God, Ryan." He stumbled over to me with shaking legs and gave me a hug. "Yeah, you have no idea how happy I am to see you," he whimpered. John had been my best friend since grade school. We grew up always hanging out, mostly wandering around the nearby woods, climbing trees, and as we reached our teens, we'd often go camping together. We had never been scared in the woods. The only strange occurrence was when we found some weird footprints one time, but that's a different story. He let go of me and grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the freezer, pouring us both a glass. "Don't you think you've had enough?" I said as he handed me my glass. John calmed down and ignored me. "Can you at least answer my question? What happened, John? I don't think I've ever seen you like this before." Like I said, he'd always been a happy-go-lucky guy. He spoke. "There's some weird crap going on in those damn woods." "What do you mean?" I asked, worried. Ryan, we found a body today," he replied. I was puzzled. I know he had found bodies before, but he'd never been this upset about it. "I'm sorry, man." I genuinely was sorry for him. "Go ahead, tell me everything." He downed the glass of whiskey in no time and poured more in it. "This was different. This wasn't like the other bodies we'd seen. There was something had been eating him, he said, swirling the glass around before he downed a second. I was still on my first. Good God, John, stop. That's enough, I said, grabbing the bottle and putting it back in the freezer. Fine, he groaned. I asked him what was eating this man's body. I don't know. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, he said. I told him to start at the beginning. He spoke. I was at HQ when we received a missing person call. The woman said she and her husband had been hiking on one of the more remote trails when her husband decided to walk a ways off the trail to take a leak. She waited for 10 minutes for her husband to come back. She yelled for him, but she didn't get a reply. She went into the trees in the direction she saw him go, but she didn't find him. She instead found blood on the ground. That's when she called us. My coworker Bill and I immediately packed our gear and headed to the location he was last seen. We didn't have to go far, because we found an arm about 100 yards off the trail, and the rest of him was about 50 yards further. The sun had already set, but we had our mag lights. When I found him, there was something else, something squatting over him, and I could hear it tearing flesh off his body as it was ripping chunks of meat off him and swallowing them. John began to tear up again, but he pulled himself back together and continued. I shined my flashlight to get a better look at what it was. I should have just ran. God, I just froze, though. Bill was just terrified. We couldn't move. It stood up and turned around towards us, giving us a full view. It was tall, about 7 feet. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and seemed like the skin was painfully stretched over old bones. It was so thin. It had a single large, pure black eye on the left side of its face, too. Its mouth opened, and it made this weird insect-like clicking sound. It didn't even have a normal mouth. It opened up like a bloomin' flower, like petals filled with rows upon rows of teeth. The mouth seemed to vibrate, too, as it made the sound. He paused, grabbed a cigarette from his pack and lit it. He took a long puff and exhaled. His story sounded insane, but the look of pure fear in his face told me otherwise. From the look of him, he seemed to be telling the truth. Sure, he would sometimes lie to prank me, but those tears, that desperate need to drink, that was all real. Please, go on, I told him, and he did. I pulled out my .45 and took aim. My coworker screamed and ran, so I prayed it'd do some damage, or at least buy us some time. It lunged at me and I fired. It wailed, and I proceeded to empty the clip that I had. However, it still stood there, though it was bleeding bad, but it acted like it was just a scratch. I ran. I'd never been so scared in my life. Jesus Christ, I thought I was gonna die. He took another drag. My lungs, my legs burned. I felt like I was gonna pass out at any second. We made it back to HQ and turned around to see if the thing had followed us, but there was nothing there. We were safe. Or we assumed we were safe. I sat there in disbelief, still holding a mostly full glass of Jack. Oh God, I replied. That sounds awful, John. Don't I know it? But it was so vivid, so real, he said, with trembling hands. Ryan, I'm done working the late shift. The police took a statement and Bill quit on the spot. The police said it was probably a hallucination caused by shock of finding a corpse like that. but I was adamant that what we saw was real. One of the officers pulled me aside and said quietly so no one else would hear, "If I were you, I'd just forget what you saw. It's better to let us handle it." Man, they know what's out there, but they won't tell us details. I'm honestly terrified to go back. Screw risking my life for this job. I'm not going out after dark again. John finished telling his experience. "I'm going to bed now, and I think you should do the same." John got up, gave me a bro hug and a thank you, and went to his room. But I didn't sleep much that night. I know this is a long and pretty unbelievable story, but I do believe there's something in the forests of northern Arkansas. Something who, just by the sight of it, has haunted my friend. Whatever it is, it doesn't care if you have family or friends. It's something that won't hesitate to rip you apart and devour you bit by bit. Be careful out there. Sometimes you don't know how scary it is out there until it's too late. Skinwalker in Wyoming, from Zezaye. This was an encounter my brother had with what he truly believes to be a skinwalker. Late one evening, my brother and his best friend decided that they wanted to go camping that night, and they brought along 2 girls that they were interested in at the time. It was a last-minute decision, but they had just enough time to set up camp before the sun faded. So they got enough supplies for 2 days of camping, quickly packing, and left to pick up the girls. After a couple of hours, they finally found a spot they liked, about 30 or so feet from a creek. With less than an hour of sufficient light, they speedily set up camp and sleeping arrangements. Now that they were ready for the night, they put together a quick fire pit and chairs. Being typical teenagers, they all cracked some beers open and jovially talked about their weeks and lives. In the middle of the conversation, they began to hear cracking branches and twigs down by the creek. Of course, this creeped them out a bit, but both my brother and his friend had sidearms, so they didn't let it bother them too much. The movement stopped shortly after, and the mood eventually rose again. Time went on, and the night soon became early morning. Since they arrived, only a couple of hours passed, but they decided to get an early start to the next day, so the group headed to their separate tents. If you ask me, I bet they were just eager to console the girls. Only about 15 minutes later, my brother heard his friend unzip his tent and walk over to his. He said, "I'm not trying to interrupt anything, but I gotta go to the bathroom." My brother knew what he was implying and decided his bladder could also use some relief. "You afraid a bear's gonna get you?" my brother said, as they approached the creek not too far. Not wanting the girls to hear, my brother's friend shrugged and began to relieve himself. Within a few seconds, it got eerily quiet. This quickly put both of them on edge. My brother says his hair stood on end. The crackling of branches and movement sent a panic between the two. A large figure on all fours appeared out of the dark on the other side of the creek. This was the largest thing my brother ever seen. His first thought about this large creature was they had just awakened a huge and most likely angry black bear. Time slowed to a crawl as they watched this large thing slowly get closer. It was only about 10 feet away when it stood up. Still in fear, my brother noticed something terrifying about this animal. It had large red glowing eyes, as if they were red LEDs instead of normal eyes. The legs on it bent backward at a weird angle, and it stood over 9 feet tall. His shock was broken when he heard a loud bang and turned to see his friend unloading his revolver at it. The noise was so sudden and deafening. My brother immediately grabbed his gun by his side and followed suit. The creature was shot in the head at least twice and the remainder of the bullets entered its body. With both pistols spent, the thing was still upright, acting only slightly annoyed. It let out a large and deafening wail that seemed somewhat human, and in the blink of an eye, it ran off along the creek faster than anything my brother had ever seen. Not knowing what to say, they both just ran back to camp. When they got back, they found the two girls shivering and terrified outside the tents, freaking out about the sounds of gunfire. Not wanting to waste any time, they all packed up in record speed. The dark drive back was quiet, somber. Paranoia and shock left them all speechless for a while, not sure of what to say. Finally, my brother's friend asked, "What the hell was that?" My brother thought for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I have no idea. Whatever it was huge." One of the girls finally decided to speak up too. "What was that loud scream we heard? What were you guys even firing at?" After exchanging glances with one another, neither of them knew how to reply. The ride home was longer and creepier after what they experienced. They were tired and shaken up. Soon enough, they arrived at my brother's friend's house and finally passed out there. The next morning, they took the girls home. After that, my brother and his friend decided to take a ride back to that spot. Maybe they could find some answers. The creek seemed slightly more off-putting. After crossing to the side the creature was on, they were surprised to find not even a trace of blood. They did find shells that they fired off, broken branches and holes in trees, but no tracks, no blood. Some time went by, and both my brother and his friend had some weird things happen to them after that night camping. They claimed to see shadowy figures stalking around after the sun goes down, but I think they're just paranoid. How could you not be after seeing something you failed to explain? I've heard this story a few times from him, but seeing the fear on my brother's face when he tells it helps validate the truth in my eyes. Why would a fake story scare him that bad? The Haunted Prison, from Amber P. I live in England. This experience has definitely left me nervous and a bit frightened. There's this prison about 10 minutes away from my house. I began to search up different ghost stories and I found the website, Gloucestershire Prison. It was around £25 to get in, and I remember being so nervous but excited. When my dad said we could go, I was very fervent and kept asking when we were going. A few weeks go by and my dad eventually gathers enough money for all of us, and I was so happy. We arrived at the prison and I felt nervous, but I was trying to act like I wasn't bothered. "You excited?" Dad asked. I nodded and grinned, saying yep. He chuckled at me. We paid the lady, who gave us 2 visitor tags to go around our necks, and a guide. "Enjoy," she exclaimed, and we both smiled before thanking her. We began walking down the odd-smelling corridor. Before I suddenly flinched and covered my heart, I saw a mannequin standing in one of the cells where the people were searched. An uneasy feeling set in my stomach, and I swallowed nervously. My dad and I walked on, silently listening for any specific sounds, but we couldn't hear a thing until I began to hear a slight tune being hummed. I grabbed my dad's shoulder and told him to stop. "Stop what?" he said. I was chilled. The humming wasn't coming from my dad. We continued on as I tried to ignore it. I looked down at the guide to try and distract myself. "Oh look," I said. "The prison was built over bodies from where they hung people." My dad nodded and began talking about something, but I didn't hear what he was saying as I was more interested in that humming again. This time I simply whispered into the nothingness, "Hello?" I was getting this eerie feeling even worse. I knew someone was watching us somewhere. I just couldn't find them. The humming became more clear, and I could tell what sound it was. It was the soft lullaby of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. The person humming it sounded feminine too. I looked around me, spinning in circles slowly. No one was there except for me, my dad, and some workers. It was quite early in the morning, so no one else was here yet, and the tours with real officers wouldn't start until nighttime. "Dad, do you hear that?" I asked, as shivers ran down my spine. I did not get a reply, and so I looked to where my dad was, but to my horror, he was no longer there. "Dad?" I yelled out, now panicking. It was dark in the building and hauntingly oppressive. "Dad!" I began speed-walking out until I got to the courtyard. "Dad, why didn't you tell me where you were going?" He looked at me. "But I did. I even told you to follow me." I glared at him, not sure that I believed him, before crossing my arms over my chest. But did you hear the humming?" I asked as I got my phone out and began to take pictures. "What are you talking about? What humming?" I shook my head. "Never mind, Dad. It was probably my imagination, I guess." As I said that, my phone began to play up. The torch turned on by itself, and it wouldn't turn off no matter what I did. "The heck?" I said, pressing the on and off button rapidly before giving up. As we began walking to the A-wing, I heard a sound like something was being dragged. "Can you hear that, at least?" I looked at my dad, who shook his head. "Still don't know what you're talking about, kiddo." As we walked up the stairs, I began to feel this heavy feeling as if something didn't want us there. Dad wrapped an arm around me and we both looked around in silence. We called out, but did not get a response. But maybe that was a good thing. We began opening the cell doors and looking in, when suddenly my dad yelled boo at me, causing me to squeal and cover my head. My dad laughed, and soon enough I was joining in. As we got to the last cell, we closed the door, then began walking away. As the door behind us closed, we both heard a loud booming sound, as if someone was walking up the hallway with very heavy boots on. Suddenly, they stopped. Then it sounded like a guard's keys were being moved about. Once again, Dad didn't hear it. But what he did hear was the sound of a cell door slamming shut. I screamed as we ran. Later on, my dad said that could probably be explained. But I firmly believed that a lot of what I heard that day had to have been something paranormal. But you never know. My dad said that we were just being pranked, being fooled into believing that the prison was haunted so we'd tell people or come back one day. Just then, I rolled my eyes and looked up at the window, and my eyes widened. I gulped. "Do you see that?" I asked my dad. "Yeah," he said, finally agreeing with me, finally seeing something that I saw. I shakily said, "Even if that's makeup, how do you make your skin transparent?" What we were looking at was someone in the window. Someone so pale and transparent that you could see the wall behind them. We walked away, absolutely creeped out. We handed our tags back to the lady and smiled. My dad asked them about there being anyone with makeup on in this tour, and she looked puzzled, explaining that they didn't run a haunted house, just a historic attraction. So no, they did not employ actors of any kind. I stared at her with wide eyes. Maybe that prison was very haunted. Northeast Ohio Skinwalkers, from Asa R. My best friend and I have hunted and fished the areas around his land for years and have had many odd experiences. One particular night didn't seem so special at first, but this was the first legitimate experience I had. We were at a father and son campout that a local church puts on every year. I was there with my dad, of course, and I was about 17. My best friend was 16 at the time. We were sitting alongside one of the two ponds on the property, fishing and talking quietly late into the night. Everyone had set up camp around the fire, except for myself and my dad. We thought it'd be fun to drive his yellow Mazda Sportster down the land bridge between the two ponds and camp up in a field behind the edge of the forest there. Now, before I continue, I need to point out that this forest butts up against my best friend's land as well, just a few miles north. There's also a huge wildlife reserve that contains a rather large Native American burial site that borders my friend's land and has its own stories and local legends. As my friend and I were sitting there fishing, we were playing with my airsoft guns that I had brought to just plink around with. They obviously didn't offer much protection, but sitting outside in the middle of nowhere at 2:30 a.m. and having them felt a bit comforting. We were sitting on the opposite side of the pond from where my dad and I set up camp. The moon was bright and full, so we could see very clearly without flashlights. The fire glowed in the distance too, behind us, about 120 yards away, and the pond being about 45 to 50 yards wide and a banana shape in length, it wrapped around to the right of us. My friend and I stopped talking at the same time as we heard something bizarre. We listened intently as we heard what sounded like two muffled voices coming from the tree line across the pond in front of us. My initial thought was some kind of cult or witches performing a ritual in the woods. Turns out, I wasn't too far off. The sound traveled from the far right of the tree line to directly in front of us, then to the left. After that, it centered to in front of us. We were both a little creeped out and getting chills from this, but we were rationalizing it to be some other campers walking around in the woods talking quietly. I mean, we probably weren't the only ones out there, right? The woods lit up with light as my dad turned on his car. He was pulling down the path to the land bridge in a panic. I got up and started running over to meet the car when it got down to our side of the pond. He stopped and was clearly upset, asking me why I was messing with him and what exactly I had been saying when I was in the woods. I told him where I'd been and that the voice he had been hearing was definitely not mine. He looked confused and said he was going to try to go back to sleep, but that he was going to sleep in the car out by the other campers. I could tell he was creeped out too, and if something was messing with the tent or yelling at him from the woods, it was too far for me to hear or know about. We continued sitting by the pond, now curious to what was going on. About 15 minutes later, we heard a loud splash come from the runoff creek for the pond. It's in the woods on the other side of the pond. I said it was probably a deer just to keep our nerves calm, but my friend looked at me and said, "Asa, deer don't go in the water at night because they can't see how deep it is." I froze and started silently praying for protection. My friend said he thought he saw something for a split second, but I didn't get a look at it. And then we both heard it. A scream. It was straightforward out of a nightmare, so feral and evil it made us both jump and sprint back to the campfire. I don't remember anything except for how hard my heart and blood were pumping in the moment. But let me tell you, it was the most terrifying thing you'd ever hear in your life. If you've seen that video on YouTube by Big Dill of someone capturing a Skinwalker scream, supposedly, that's eerily similar to what I heard. Things got weirder that morning. We walked out there before anyone else got up to look for signs of what it was. We found huge tracks of what looked like massive wolf paws, but wolves don't have 8 toes on their paws. Whatever this thing was, it did. I guess all I can say is that this world is pretty strange. The woods is spooky. Might as well bring the whole military if you're planning a simple jog through the mountains. Even then, if they take their eyes off of you for even a moment, you're probably a goner. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you want your own story narrated, first thing you need to do is send it to us at darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. If you want to support the show, check the links in the description for a link to my Patreon, a link to my merch store, or a link to start investing with Acorns. That helps me out a bit too. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode, titled The Sounds of Cracking Bones, 5 True Scary Stories. Herobrine854035 Max says, do sightings of Jesus. Herobrine, I do scary stories. Jose Chavez says, broke my wrist in a crash yesterday. Well, darn, I hope you feel better soon. That does match the title of that video, though. Malaki LaForge says, like so my peanut can grow an inch. Just leave a like there, click for a heart, wonder if that'll help. Animsir Nedship says, sometimes your voice gives me nightmares. Well, then I'm doing my job right. And Mimi Katzen says, I'm a simple witch. I see dark stories, I click. Then I see the Wiccan on the video and I die happy. Well, you better get resurrected soon so you don't miss out on any new videos. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, more scary stories are on the way soon. So stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my patrons who continue to donate. They're awesome people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.